Hi everyone, my name's Jason Spendelow. I'm a clinical psychologist, and this is a re-recording of a talk that I did live for Pseudomyxoma survivor. So we've re-recorded this for people who weren't able to attend the live session, so you could get the information that we covered in that live talk. So it's going to be a bit shorter than the live talk because I won't be responding to the questions and comments that people made throughout the webinar, but hopefully you find this presentation useful. This is the second, or was the second, of 3 presentations we did in January and February of 2021. So this is talk number 2, so you may want to go back and look at talk number 1 first if you're interested, because some of the things we talk about in this particular webinar built on some of the things we covered in the first talk. All right, okay, so what we're going to talk about here is loss and grief in cancer. These are really important psychological issues that people confront. And while we'll talk about it in the context of cancer, they apply quite well to a range of other major and serious or life-limiting medical conditions as well. So this is Charlotte. This is my wife who lost her battle with PMP back in 2017. So I'd just like to acknowledge her and give you a bit of an explanation for why I've ended up working in this field and having a link with Pseudomyxoma survivor specifically. Right, what we're going to cover here is some concepts around grief and loss. We're going to talk about the range of losses that people can encounter in cancer. We're going to have a think about some theories of grief, and then we're going to have a look at coping. So what we talk about in this particular webinar may be difficult for you to think about, which is really normal. So you should think about the need for some extra support following watching this video. And you can obviously feel free to pause and take a break wherever you want to. And you can think about local support services that you may be able to access if needed to. And on this slide, we've just got example links to UK and US sources of support for you. But there usually be something in your local area, wherever in the world it is that you're watching this from. We're going to start with a little exercise called an expansion exercise. So what I want you to do is make sure that you're sitting comfortably, with your arms relaxed, your feet flat on the floor. And if you're comfortable to do so, gently close your eyes. If not, you can keep your eyes open, but think about kind of a soft or kind of blurry focus with your eyes. So not looking at anything in particular, just kind of looking through whatever it is that you're seeing in your field of vision, rather than focusing on a specific object. So whenever you're feeling an unpleasant emotion or sensation in your body, the first thing that we want to do in this expansion exercise is to take a few slow, deep breaths. So just in your own time, take some nice big belly breaths in and out. And just do that a few times at your own pace, just as a way to get us tuned into the body for this particular exercise. Now, what I want you to do is just quickly scan your body from head to toe and just pick up on any unpleasant sensations in the body. It might be an unpleasant emotion or a source of physical pain or discomfort that might be associated with your diagnosis. Just quickly scan the body from head to toe and just note any uncomfortable, unpleasant, or unwanted sensations in your physical body right now. So you'll probably notice several uncomfortable sensations, and I want you to look for the strongest sensation, the one that bothers you the most. It may be a lump in your throat, for example, a knot in your stomach, or an ache in a particular part of your body. What I want you to do is really focus your attention on that sensation. And as much as possible, I want you to try and observe it in an interested or kind of curious way, as if you're a inquisitive child or a scientist who's discovering some new or unusual phenomenon that they want to study and learn more about. So just observe the sensation carefully. Notice where it starts and where it ends. I want you to try and learn as much about this sensation as you can. If you had to draw a line around the sensation, what would that outline look like? Is it on the surface of the body or inside? Or is it both? How far inside the body does it go? Where is the sensation most intense? Where is it weakest? How is it different in the center rather than around the edges? Is there any pulsation or vibration within it? What's the weight, light or heavy? What about the temperature? And also, is the sensation moving or is it still? If it's moving, in what way is it moving? Now that you've really focused in on this sensation, I want you to take a few more deep breaths, just in your own time. And as you take those breaths, I want you to let go of the struggle with that sensation. Let go of the desire to want to control it or suppress it or get rid of it. As you breathe, I want you to imagine that your breath is flowing in and around this sensation. So now I want you to start to make room for the sensation. Just kind of loosen up the space around it. Just for now, allow it to be there. You don't have to like it. You don't have to want it to be there. But just for now, allow it to be there. Just let it be. What you're trying to do is just to kind of gently observe the sensation, not to think about it. So when your mind starts commenting on what's happened, just kind of note that, acknowledge it, and then come back to the observing. So if you find it difficult, this is completely okay. This is quite normal. You might feel a strong urge to return to fighting or suppressing the sensation. Just when you notice that, acknowledge that tendency and just return to the sensation, observing it and allowing it to be there. Don't want you to try and alter the sensation, but if it changes by itself, that's absolutely fine. We're not trying to get rid of this. We're trying to make room for it and allow it to be there temporarily. Keep breathing. Really increase the amount of room that you're making for this sensation. Give it some space, give it some extra room, and allow it to be there. And just spend as much time as you need to allowing the sensation to be there and just observing it. Remember, we're not trying to alter the sensation in any way, but if you do get a change, that's absolutely fine too. What we're doing is developing your ability to observe, sit with the sensation, and giving up the struggle to try and suppress it. I want you just to take a few more breaths in your own time, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes again. All right. So that was an expansion exercise, which some people find useful for helping them tolerate sensation, feeling within the body that they'd rather not have, but having a hard time distracting themselves from. With these types of experiences, it can be useful to try and drop that energy or that attempt to try and control something that you can't control or not having a lot of success in a particular moment controlling. So this expansion has the 4 components as shown on the slide, where we just observe the sensation, breathe around it, expand or make room for it, and really just allow it to be there. So instead of struggling with it, we try as much as possible and switch to an observational stance towards it. This can take a bit of practice. It can be a bit weird as well at first. But certainly if you found this kind of useful, or at least interesting, then that's something you can keep coming back to and trying and experimenting with and just see how you get on. All right. So this is kind of question I'm going to pose to you, and please feel free to pause the video, have a think about your answers, even kind of write them down on a piece of paper, and then come back to the video and press play again. But if you'd like, I want you to think about this question: what have you lost as a result of cancer or some other condition that you're struggling with or having to live with at the moment? So just pause the video if you like to think about this and come back when you're ready. Many people in the live version of this talk refer to all sorts of losses and all different forms. Losses of roles, jobs, the life that they had for themselves. It's really very varied, and we'll talk about this a bit more in this talk, that losses that people experience as a result of serious illnesses like cancer are many and varied. So it's not just one type of thing or loss that you're coping with. Often there's many things that you're contending with. But if you think about loss specifically in a bit more detail, loss is an unavoidable and universal experience in life. We all experience loss many times, in fact, over the course of our lives. And as I mentioned, loss can come in many forms. So occupational losses, losing a job, death of a pet. We can have loss in relationships, endings to relationships, changes in relationships. We can have losses in terms of our physical functioning. And we can lose an anticipated or hoped for future. We can also lose changes in our role or our identity that were important to us, and loss of kind of certainty, an inability to plan, and that really relates to this loss of a anticipated or expected future. Now, when we think about grief, this is a specific reaction to loss, specific type of reaction, and it's often used in the context of someone's death, but it can apply equally as validly in other areas. And grief looks like many different things. We can think about grief in terms of the feelings associated with this experience. So feelings such as numbness, sadness, anxiety, anger is another common one. Often there's a real emotional roller coaster involved with grief. Thoughts or a thinking component to grief, we can have thoughts of disbelief and confusion, feeling kind of stuck. These are quite common as well. Physical experiences or sensations that come with grief, fatigue, very common. Any other thing from an upset stomach through to headache and muscle tension. This can be all part of grief. And behavioural features or changes that come as a result of grief often include sleep problems, loss of interest in activities, change in appetite, feeling irritable, restless, or the opposite, feeling very kind of sluggish. So another concept which is quite relevant to what we're talking about today is indefinite loss. This is a set of very kind of major, profound, and continuing grief responses resulting from, the loss or absence of a really important part of yourself or your life or another person, particularly when for that person there's a deep attachment to them. This particular definition of indefinite loss came through some work in trying to understand parents of children born with learning or intellectual disabilities. And we have a situation where the young person survives and continues to grow, but for the parent, there's a real loss of what they were expecting to experience as a parent, and seeing the ongoing battles and struggles that the person might have through their lives. It's a source of kind of ongoing loss. And this is a particular form of loss, also known as chronic sorrow, that people can face. So I'm just wondering for you whether this concept of indefinite loss might be applicable. I've worked with many people with medical conditions for whom indefinite loss is relevant because through their illness or their injury or disability, they've lost some really important stuff in their life, and that loss is kind of ongoing without the kind of opportunity to really formally kind of mark that in some way. When someone dies, there's a funeral, right? And so there's this kind of ritual or this kind of event to signal, a loss has been experienced. But with indefinite loss, often those kind of signals or rituals aren't there, which can make it more challenging. So if you think about whether indefinite loss applies to you in some way, feel free to pause the video and come back when you're ready to start again. Another concept to think about in this broader category or topic of loss and grief is something called anticipatory grief. So this relates to feelings of grief or stress that occurs before a loss actually materializes or comes about in our lives. So some examples here on the slide, the anticipated loss of functioning. Say if you're going for a major kind of surgical medical procedure where you're going to lose some sort of functioning or capacity to use your body in some way. If we have children leaving home, this is a really common experience that parents will have in their lives as their children kind of grow and move on with their lives. And the build up to that can be really difficult for people because often this involves a change in role, a change in relationship to to your children. And loss and grief can occur in the absence of a kind of clear event. And this applies to many people, as I mentioned. So it might be useful to think about how anticipated grief applies to your life. Perhaps there's something upcoming that you're thinking about, or you can look back to other times previously in your life where you've anticipated some kind of loss. So loss and grief can play out over really long periods, which is quite difficult for people. Often people want to know, when am I going to feel better? And loss and grief are as much about what goes on in your head as what's happening in the real world. So as we've kind of mentioned in some previous slides there, the anticipation and kind of perceptions of loss are really important in terms of your experience of loss and grief. And as I also mentioned, often a lack of kind of symbols or rituals and quote unquote kind of evidence when coping with loss, grief and adjustment. These can be difficult things. And we have the example of carers. This is quite important, where carers often experience all sorts of kind of changes that can bring up loss and grief issues. A really good example within the group of carers would be kind of a change in role. So if your spouse becomes ill with cancer, so as I experienced a change in role in my life, going from kind of husband to being kind of a carer and advocate, really, and certainly that changed the dynamics within the relationship. So what has been the biggest challenge associated with your own grief? So starting to put some of these ideas together, and you look back over the time since you've been diagnosed with cancer or your condition, what have been the biggest challenges for you in regards to the grief that you've encountered? So take a few minutes again to think about this if you like. Pause the video and just come back when you're ready. So I want to talk a little bit about models of loss and grief. So researchers have tried to understand loss and grief through models. And models are basically a theory of how a psychological phenomenon works. And we see theories and models in all kind of branches of psychology. And loss and grief is no exception. And when we think about a psychological model, they will typically include information such as the things that exert or are believed to exert influence over the process in question. So I often call these kind of factors or variables. How these variables are related to each other, how they influence or interact over time. What outcomes might occur. Models also include information such as other things that might be relevant, the role of the wider environment, for example. So it's important to remember that theory merely represents something that we cannot see or touch. And models of loss grief may or may not reflect your own experiences. So if you've come across or have come across or will come across a model of loss or grief that seems to resonate well for you and it's a helpful way to think about your experience, then brilliant. But if not, it's absolutely fine as well. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with you at all. There's not a one size that fits all, certainly in terms of models and theories of psychological phenomena such as loss and grief. But I want to mention one particular model of grief because it's so well known. And this is the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. Many people have come across this. And this model comes from work of psychiatrists, work in palliative settings. And Kubler-Ross wrote a book called On Death and Dying and really talked about these stages. You know, as I said, it's really well known, but there's not very much evidence to support it. And the popularity of this model, I think, is really been decreasing over time. There's a misconception that stages are linear, that stages of grief are linear, but it's often not the case. when we see it play out in reality. But with Kubler-Ross, there's 5 stages here. One's denial. So that's thinking, it's not me, this can't possibly be true. We have an anger stage, people becoming upset, distressed, and angered around why this has happened to them. Kubler-Ross talks about a stage called bargaining, where people engage in a process of trying to promise or state that they're going to behave well, and hoping that the universe or something is going to give them a different or more favourable outcome to that which they have been dealt. Depression is the 4th stage, and this is really the kind of reaction to the illness, and we're starting to see people move into the 5th stage here, where it's more of kind of acceptance stage, where, okay, I know this is happening, I've stopped fighting it to some degree, and I'm starting to think about how I'm going to cope or prepare for what happens next. Yeah, so this is Kubler-Ross. I'm not a huge fan, as many other people, and I think there's some other ways to think about grief. And one that I particularly like is called the dual process model. The dual process model of grief tries to describe how people come to terms with the losses that they experience. And there are 2 processes thought to be going on in grief. One process is a loss-orientated response, or loss-orientated responses. And this is where an individual focuses on or tries to deal with the loss itself in terms of the thoughts and the behaviours. So I've got an example here on the slide. So thinking about a person who's died, looking at photos of them, letting yourself be upset, cry, really experience that distress. And then we've got a second process that can go on, which involves restoration-orientated responses. And these are things that you do to kind of cope with the loss-orientated sources of stress. So if you, for example, lose your spouse and you become lonely as a result, as one of the many effects, then perhaps visiting people to cope with that loneliness could be seen as a restoration-orientated response. So we're trying to cope with the sources of stress that have come from that loss. The other feature of this dual process model is that an oscillation or a movement takes place between these loss-orientated responses and the restoration-orientated responses. So we've got people allowing themselves to experience the grief and try and kind of process the grief, but then we've got them swapping to a mode where they then try and cope in a positive way with those sources of stress that have come from the loss. So this moving back and forth process is thought to be an important way for people to adjust or come to terms with the loss over time. If you're stuck in just one all the time and not the other, then you're quite likely to experience difficulties. Yeah, so there's a lot going on when responding to loss and grief. We've got emotional things happening, we've got kind of cognitive or thoughts happening, and we've got practical and behavioural changes or things happening as well in the context of loss and grief experiences. So you might find it helpful to think about how you're managing in each of these areas, because this process of grief can get stuck, or people can get stuck in their grief or take unhelpful detours when there isn't this healthy balance of switching between loss and restoration, or not kind of addressing, you know, one of these components of emotional thinking and kind of behavioural responses or challenges that occur. So here's a little example of what I'm talking about around people getting stuck or experiencing difficulties over and above what we would normally expect. So here's a thought that or a statement I've come across many times. I have so much to deal with, I can't cope with thinking about what I'm grieving as well. So this is an example of someone saying that I don't have the mental capacity to start to really lean into or turn towards the topic around the grief itself. If we think about loss and grief, we can think about this as a difficult inner state. Now, if you watched the first talk in this series, we talked about difficult inner states as any difficult psychological experience. Difficult inner states are a very normal, natural part of life because our brains are essentially hardwired to produce difficult inner states. Anxiety might be a nice example of a difficult inner state that we're all familiar with. But if we think about difficult inner states, we can break them down to components of thoughts, feelings, behavior, and physiology or physical responses, as shown in this diagram here. And we can think about loss and grief as a type of difficult inner state. Difficult inner states are sending important messages to us, and it's the body's kind of adjustment mechanism or a way of trying to come to terms with what changes you're encountering as a result of loss and grief. If you think about an inflamed and tender surgical incision after a surgical procedure, the fact that the tenderness and the inflammation is partly about, or partly signals, the body's healing process trying to occur. And so because a difficult inner state itself is uncomfortable and unpleasant as well, we could think of difficult inner state as that part of that body's attempt to kind of heal itself, if you like, in the context of grief and loss. And what we can do with difficult inner states is act according to core values. As a way to kind of cope with difficult inner states. Often people will think, well, what do I do with this difficult inner state? How am I going to get by? It's always there. And one useful route that people can take is to think about kind of a values-based response. So I'm experiencing this difficult inner state. How could I respond to this in this moment that's consistent with my core values? And again, in the first talk in this series, we talked in a lot more detail about using values as a way to guide our responses to difficult inner states. Coping with grief and cancer, responding to difficult emotions. Emotional pain is part of the process of grief in any context, including cancer and other serious conditions. And one thing you can do is gently kind of lean into or sit with difficult feelings. I use this example often. Here, if we think about this bit of paper as a difficult inner state, when we try and fight or suppress the difficult inner state, often what will happen is that we'll get more of it. It's quite common with psychological or internal experiences. Often the less we want something, the more of it we'll actually have. And that's made doubly the case when we start to say, no, I don't want this difficult inner state. I must get rid of it. I can't stand it. And what's wrong with me? Why can't I get rid of this? So what we're doing is taking this original difficult inner state and suddenly making it a lot bigger. Because now not only are we dealing with the original difficult inner state, that is kind of grief and loss, we are now kind of relating to that difficult inner state in a really problematic way that just inflames it and makes it a much bigger prospect to deal with. So if we think about that expansion exercise we did at the beginning of this talk, this is a way to try and give up that struggle, to suppress, fight with something that's actually very hard to get rid of in practice. And so effectively, through expansion, we can think about us trying to take that layer off the original difficult inner state and give us something that's relatively more manageable to deal with. It doesn't take away that original ball of paper or difficult inner state, but it stops it kind of growing to something much bigger. We can also think about leaning into difficult inner states in other ways, such as breathing exercise. And again, in the first talk, we did diaphragmatic breathing exercise. And there's various body scan exercises that people can engage with as well to stop that unproductive, unhelpful, and ineffective struggle. If we also think about coping with grief and cancer in terms of the cognitive or thinking component or strategies, we've got many challenges in the context of cancer that we're trying to juggle and deal with. Reformulating identities, reconstructing relationships, adjusting kind of our core beliefs or kind of belief systems, because getting cancer is such a profound thing. It can blow out of the water many of our really fundamental assumptions and beliefs that we have about the world. And we've also got this challenge of dealing with really difficult and negative day-to-day thoughts. What we often do is think about kind of normalize. We can think about self-compassion, and we can think about reflecting on difficult thoughts. So I wanted to focus on the skill of reflecting on difficult thoughts, because we talked about normalize in the first webinar here. So one way that we can reflect on difficult thoughts is to start with a body scan or breathing exercise, even an expansion exercise. And from that point, start to write down all the things that your brain's saying to you as part of your difficult inner state. I can't cope with this. Why can't I feel better? This isn't fair. What's going to happen to me? Those are all kind of examples of thoughts you might experience as part of a difficult inner state. And from there, once you've come up with a list of as many thoughts that you can come up with as possible, you can think about trying to identify what we call the hot thought, or from that list of thoughts that you've recorded, the thought that seems to generate the most of the unpleasant emotional component of your difficult inner state. What you can do then with that hot thought is apply almost an endless number of questions as a way to try and challenge or look at the hot thought from a different perspective that might be more useful for you. And I've just put down a few examples on the slide of the types of questions you can apply or ask of that hot thought. One is, what's the evidence for and against the accuracy of this thought? So here we're taking the approach of really trying to evaluate how accurate this difficult or hot thought is for you. So, everyone thinks I'm incompetent, for example. This is a good example of a hot thought for which this evidence for and against strategy can be quite useful. And when you've looked at or written down all the evidence for and against the hot thought you can come up with, but it's important to kind of step back and say, well, looking at all this evidence, both for and against, on balance, which do I think is, what do I think about the accuracy of this original hot thought? And if it's not particularly accurate, you can think about or have a go at trying to brainstorm a more accurate thought to replace it with. Another thing you can do with a hot thought is simply to ask, is this thought helpful, given what I'm trying to achieve in terms of my coping or dealing with loss and grief? If the answer is no, then again, you can follow that up with, well, what would be a more helpful thought? And a third example here is that you can ask yourself, what would I say to a friend or someone I care about who had this hot thought? And that perspective shifting can sometimes be quite a nice way for people to think about or interpret that hot thought in a slightly different way. So when we think about behavioural strategies in coping with grief, we can think about responding to a difficult inner state by asking ourselves, what's something that I could do right now in light of this difficult inner state that's consistent with one or more of my core values? Again, in the first talk, we we did discuss values quite a bit and gave you a link through to a values identification exercise. So feel free to go back and look at that and do that exercise to help you identify your current important core beliefs. But this question is quite useful if we have our core beliefs quite clearly in our mind, because then we can think about potentially a number of different behavioural responses that are consistent with the type of person we want to be or the type of life we want to lead. So, for example, if one of your core values was humour, then something you might do in the moment is trying to take a light-hearted interpretation or response to a difficult inner state. Look and see the kind of funny side of things if that's possible. You know, sometimes that's completely inappropriate and doesn't work for people because they're just too upset. But that would be one option. Another example would be if relationships was a core value for you, or nurturing or having good relationships, then a values consistent response to grief or difficult in a state in that situation might be to actually go and connect with someone, have a discussion, talk to them about what's going on, and look to perhaps mutually support each other, particularly if that grief is shared in some way. And in terms of another behavioural strategy, we can think about allowing yourself these loss and restoration orientated activities. So going back to that dual process model, allowing yourself to switch between the loss and the restoration orientated strategies. So allowing yourself to be upset at times, provided then you do try and switch to more restoration orientated activities and then back again, and go kind of back and forth as often as you need to, but trying to avoid the trap of getting stuck in one or other position. So that's a really kind of whirlwind journey, if you like, through loss and grief, and just pointing to you towards a few strategies. You know, I've not so much kind of covered the how-to of these strategies, but just tried to give you the sense that there are lots of options out there for coping with grief issues within cancer, and just wanted to give you a flavour for what's out there. But if we try and draw the strands together a little bit, loss, as I've mentioned, is an unavoidable part of life. You know, this is one of these many difficult inner states which we can't avoid in life. They do occur. And grief is a particular type of response to loss. As you well know, we're faced with many losses in cancer. It's one of the really difficult psychological challenges of this particular condition. And there are no rules with grieving. Other than, well, I do have a rule. When I work with people, I talk about trying to have a balance or a range of strategies. I think that's quite important, but otherwise there is no one size fits all. And even if you experience different losses, you know, within your lifetime, the way you might kind of respond to or grieve in one part of your life may not be the same as how you respond to grief at another time. As I mentioned, we can use this difficult inner state concept as a way to kind of frame or think about loss and grief. And we can also consider a number of different kind of emotional, cognitive, and behavioural responses to our grief, just to help us manage this really formidable challenge. Right, at this point, I asked for questions and comments when I was in the live version of this talk, but you are really welcome to reach out and ask me any questions by email if you have them. I'll be really happy to respond with anything that you're curious about or want more information on. Great. Oh, there's an ugly photo of myself. That gets us through to the last slide. Don't forget Pseudomyxoma Survivor, really wonderful charity, doing some great work out there. And hopefully you can support them in some way. So thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in and having a watch of the video. And all my best to you in coping with your own loss and grief issues and associated with your own diagnosis. Bye-bye.